Throughout history, great presidents have benefited from the wisdom and counsel of their first ladies. From John and Abigail Adams to Abraham and Mary Lincoln, the interconnectedness of the men and women who have occupied the White House has formed a great source of support for many presidents at their best. Please check out our podcast on Eleanor Roosevelt for the best modern example of a first lady who helped advise her husband. There were others that were very supportive, and I could name a whole list of them, and who were good in terms of many other things, and very good in terms of their charity work and other things, but in terms of advising.
Today, we will look at a well-known presidential figure who has perhaps been judged somewhat short-sightedly by history. Although Herbert Hoover's presidency was not a success, he laid the foundation for many leaders and policies to come, and had a remarkable career before and after his time in the White House. Because she was less well known than other first ladies, the unique abilities of President Hoover's wife, which she brought to the marriage and a full partnership, aren't as well known as some other first ladies. President Hoover's brilliant wife, Lou Henry Hoover, was a bulwark of his achievements both in and outside of the White House. Because of the unfortunate circumstances of his presidency, many historians have relegated President Hoover to the also-rans, meaning the less effective. His efforts to fight the Great Depression, although not nearly as successful or as dramatic as Franklin Roosevelt's, were rooted in the same basic set of principles and desire to help people in need. His work throughout a life of 90 years is far more complex than we thought, and deserves more than the fifth grade impression, implying he did nothing and simply allowed the country to drift. Lou Henry Hoover served as a geologist, teacher, and businesswoman at different times in her life. She was a woman who ran a mining business at a time when women did not have the vote on a national scale. Check out our Marjorie Post podcast for another example of a dynamic woman very much ahead of her time. Mrs. Hoover was by the president's side in his outstanding achievements early in his career as a mining engineer, and also during his work to feed the nations of Europe after the First World War. She was also a pioneer for women's rights, spoke 8 languages, and wrote a master's thesis on geology, no less, in Latin. While at Stanford University, she met Herbert Hoover, then a mining prodigy who wanted to explore the world. Lou Henry Hoover led a lengthy, exciting, self-directed life.
Can you
defied convention.
Imagine a woman being a mining engineer in the 19th century? Hard for me to imagine because of the way things were. Now, Lou Hoover worked as a mining engineer for a family friend before her marriage and later by her husband's side. The Hoovers married in 1899 when Herbert Hoover returned from a year-long assignment monitoring gold mining in Australia. At that time, Australia was divided into 4 separate colonies, so Herbert Hoover's job was to inspect sanitary conditions in mining camps and assure equality in wages in all 4 regions. The following year, the Hoovers, both Hoovers, Herbert and Lou, traveled to China. The Red Cross had asked several American and British businessmen to check on mining conditions in Taiwan. Herbert Hoover led this effort, while Lou Hoover rescued and housed 20 refugee children during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900.
That's a story I'd never heard of, but it needs to be told. It's very intriguing to me when the Hoovers desired privacy in their time in the White House. They would speak to each other in Mandarin. After the First World War, Herbert Hoover became involved in the European Relief Commission. It had begun earlier during the war, but continued as both the Belgians and Russians were completely starving. Leonardo Newtick, in his wonderful book, The Humanitarian Achievements of Herbert Hoover, details Hoover's vision for using his talents to help others. The Hoover desire was rooted in Herbert and Lou Henry Hoover's upbringing. Yet, like many of the era, they truly developed their passion for it, that is, helping others, as they witnessed the carnage of the First World War up close and in person. The Hoovers began their assistance and were both instrumental in providing aid to those affected by the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. Herbert Hoover was a businessman living in London at the time. His name came into national prominence when he arranged to furnish emergency funds and transportation home for more than 100,000 American tourists stranded in England by the war. Lou Henry Hoover also provided her own resources like food and clothing for those
That's a
who remained
remarkable
stranded.
achievement. After Herbert Hoover established the Commission for Relief in Belgium, this so-called CRB, to feed the citizens of German-occupied Belgium, Lou Henry Hoover helped raise funds for one of Belgium's first food shipments by starting a California branch of the CRB. Herbert Hoover also recruited a small army of philanthropists throughout the country, in and outside of the government. Lou was essential in negotiating with Belgium's King Albert I, having late night conversations with the king in French, which I'm sure impressed him. Soon, Hoover's success led him to be named director of a national food administration.
When World War I began in August 1914, Germany invaded the neutral country of Belgium, hoping to overrun France quickly. By October of 1914, food supplies in Belgium were nearly exhausted. The American ambassadors to Belgium and Great Britain persuaded the British to allow the importation of food under American supervision on condition that none of it would go to Germany or to feed the German occupying army in Belgium. They also promised the Germans that the distribution would not be used to aid the Allies or spy on the German military. As we said, Herbert Hoover was asked to lead the project, which came to be called the Commission for Relief in
To
Belgium.
distribute food equitably and prevent the growth of the black market, the CRB collected and rationed all locally grown food and imported supplies. By mid-November, food supplies reached all parts of occupied Belgium, and there was no catastrophic famine from that point forward, though rations were strictly limited for the duration of the war. They had to be. There was a limited supply. Herbert Hoover gained worldwide fame as the great humanitarian for creating an unprecedented organization that fed up to 10 million civilians for 5 years in the midst of a war zone. Don't know how I managed that. In 1917, the United States entered the war, and Hoover, now a famous humanitarian, returned stateside to be appointed by President Woodrow Wilson as the head of the new U.S. Food Administration. Under Hoover's leadership, the Food Administration dramatically increased farm production by influencing market prices with massive government purchasing and appealed to the general public to voluntarily reduce consumption without resorting to rationing. Hoover helped feed 2 million Polish families. A street in Krakow bore his name from 1919 to 1940, and that name was restored after the fall of the communist regime. Without her husband's official knowledge, Lou Hoover made a secret trip to Poland to distribute supplies during a Russian invasion of Warsaw in 1921. The woman had some guts.
She sure did. I don't have proof of this, but the rumor is she personally told Leon Trotsky, who was complaining about her as a spy, for heaven's sakes, I'm bringing people food, not guns. Due to all this success, Hoover became a household name. Jonah Goldberg's masterwork, Liberal Fascism, talks about his work in this period. To Hooverize meant to economize on food. Americans began observing meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and planting war gardens. Within a year, the United States dramatically increased food shipments to Europe. After the armistice was signed in November 1918, President Wilson appointed Hoover to head the American Relief Administration. Herbert Hoover channeled 34 million tons of American food, clothing, and supplies to war-torn Europe, including Armenia and Soviet Russia. When Herbert Hoover became Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and Coolidge administrations, was his beloved wife, who very quietly, without public fanfare, assisted him as she always had in so many ways. During Herbert Hoover's celebrated relief efforts after the floods in Mississippi in 1927, it was Lou Hoover who cooked for dispossessed farmers, read stories to frightened children who had lost their homes, and insisted Native and African American farmers get their fair and equal share of government assistance.
Radical for those days. Radical. The first effort to educate young people with exceptionalities, hey, that was a Hoover project. Lou Hoover's involvement with the Washington, D.C. Crippled Children's Asylum was involved in that. She created the asylum's library, led to a desire to improve education among the exceptionality community. And she recruited a guy named James E. West, the man who brought the Boy Scout movement to the United States, to take charge of the education of the paralyzed community in Washington, D.C. in 1931. President Hoover increased the federal budget to include children's programs. In 1930, just to go back a little bit, he hosted the first ever White House Conference on Child Health and Protection. As James Dolan's great humanitarian stated, the conference prepared technical findings and recommendations regarding every conceivable childhood concern, from prenatal care and a safe environment during childhood to expanded educational opportunities and the promise of health care for the physically and mentally handicapped. A Children's Charter of Rights was prepared to summarize the conference's essential recommendations. The government was responsible for obtaining and protecting those rights on behalf of the nation's children. These initiatives were taken forward by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, which took giant steps to fulfill the Children's Charter developed by Hoover, and his conference as part of their lifelong desire to promote opportunities for young women. Mrs. Hoover became a patron of the Girl Scouts, founded by her friend, Juliet Gordon Howe.
Mrs. Hoover's actions began the tradition of First Ladies serving as president of the Girl Scouts and Brownie movement of the United States. Mrs. Hoover, as the First Lady to ever be on the radio, addressed at a nationwide meeting of Gold Award winners from the White House in 1931. Mrs. Hoover also persuaded the Girl Scouts, after she left the White House, to create their famous cookie selling program to raise money for all sorts of troop projects. At a time when segregation was very prominent, unfortunately, Mrs. Hoover defied segregationist attitudes by hosting a luncheon in the White House for Illinois Congressman Oscar Dupreece, the prominent and only African-American congressman during this period. Sadly, President Hoover's time as the nation's executive was defined by the Depression. His efforts to fight the Great Depression involved more public works programs than any other president. When it became clear in 1931 that the financial tailspin was not abating, President Hoover convinced Congress to accept a moratorium on the payment of international debts and enacted a series of federal policies to stimulate the economy that some historians have called the Hoover New Deal. The new Reconstruction Finance Corporation, established in January 1932, lent tax dollars to bail out American banks and businesses. The Emergency Relief and Construction Act, enacted in July 1932, broadened the agency's power to include financing state and local public works projects, as well as loaning money for state-sponsored relief programs. Mrs. Hoover organized the National Clothing Drive, spent the night in a homeless shelter in Arlington, Virginia, and donated money earmarked for state dinners to the Red Cross.
Yeah, lest we be less than honest here, some of those things perhaps had a deleterious or negative effect on the Depression. For example, the tariffs and some of the other things that he instituted, but it was experimental and he needed to do something and he wanted to do something. Unfortunately, it also did not enhance international cooperation, just to mention a couple of things there. But anyhow, Hoover also approved substantial farm subsidy increases, which stayed for a long time, very long time. I think they may even be still in extant now. He eased requirements for issuing Federal Reserve notes and established the Federal Home Loan Bank Board to support mortgages. In an attempt to pay for the new programs, Hoover signed the Revenue Act of 1932, which doubled the estate tax, hiked corporate tax rates, and increased the top personal tax rate from 25 to 63%. Let that sink in. Although Roosevelt would oversee a dramatic expansion of the federal government himself, he attacked Hoover during the 1932 presidential campaign for engaging in reckless and extravagant spending and ran on a platform for an immediate and drastic reduction of governmental expenditures by at least 25%. Roosevelt's running mate, John Nance Garner, went so far as to accuse Hoover of leading the country down the path of socialism.
Wow, that's ironic considering what happened in later years.
Yes.
Hoover was strongly opposed to alcohol. This was at the height of Prohibition, and his efforts to enforce that law brought about a very funny retort from famed comedian and radio broadcaster Will Rogers. He said, the president decided he didn't want the folks to have anything to drink, and the bankers liked that idea so much, they thought the country shouldn't have anything to eat either.
Oh, Lord.
After FDR defeated Hoover soundly in the 1932 election, the two Hoovers spent their time between Palo Alto in California and the Waldorf Hotel in New York. As the New Deal rebuilt the economy while greatly expanding government power, the ex-president was alarmed as he was concerned a culture of dependence was being created. Now, I want to say something here that a lot of people don't know. There was even some talk in the 1920s of Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover running on a ticket together as a gesture of national unity. They were not then the rivals they became later on. But President Hoover's focus became the creation of the Hoover Institute, which was a research center that had a collection of documents relating to the historical research of the 20th century. Mrs. Lou Hoover died in 1944, just as her husband was beginning his 3-volume, 2,000-page magnum opus book entitled Freedom Betrayed. This book looked at the consequences of the decision to ally with the Soviet Union in World War II and their takeover of Eastern Europe later on.
Yeah, and there's some good insights in that. And I challenge my liberal friends to check it out. As I have said so many times, just because somebody doesn't agree with you on something doesn't mean you can't learn something from them. And also, history is written by who?
Victors.
The victors. So, yeah, you need to check things out. Use your own brain, people, your own eyes, people, your own ears, people. Don't just rely on others. Don't rely on what I say either. Check it out.
Or what I say. Look at things from as many points of view as possible.
Absolutely. Getting back to our timeline here, Herbert Hoover outlived his beloved wife by 20 years. He served as an advisor to Secretary of State George Marshall's European Recovery Plan. In 1946, at the age of 72, Herbert Hoover spent 3 months observing business conditions in Western Europe. In 1947, he helped design the first democratic local government in the Western occupation zones in Germany. In 1951, at President Truman's request, he chaired a government commission on streamlining bureaucracy. President Hoover continued to serve the country until his death in 1964 at the age of 90.
A lifetime of service that should be looked at and well respected. I also want to say it was he who persuaded the Congress to offer ex-presidents a pension, because after President Truman left the White House in 1953, he was virtually bankrupt. So Hoover asked for a pension he did not need. He gave his payments of it to charity because he wanted to establish for ex-presidents, and he didn't want President Truman to feel like a beggar. It was my joy to visit the wonderful Hoover Institute on Peace and War in Palo Alto, California in 2023. I studied many excellent papers, many historical documents, and wonderful Taiwanese documents I'm using in expanding my dissertation, and also the writings of one of my idols, noted political author Alan Drury, in his year-long preparation in 1965 for his book on apartheid South Africa, A Very Strange Society. I think it only fair that I thank some of the people here that have helped me. the Hoover Institute archivist, Dr. Eric Waken, the head librarian, Miss Frances Baker, and Dr. Jane McNamara, who I spoke to recently from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa. If you get a chance, the library is closed at the moment. If you get a chance to go to the Institute in California, my friends, grab it. It's a wonderful place. People are very helpful and friendly. If you want more information on that, we did a podcast on my travels in California and New York in 2023. I also want to express my deep gratitude to my brother, Ryan McFay, for going along on the trip, assisting me in finding documents, our late night conversations, and introducing me to jalapeno onion rings on our trip to San Jose in 2023. You see, you learn something new every time we put on one of these podcasts. I don't know why, but it's been a lot of hard work and a lot of fun. So I just want to thank you all. Remember, give us a like and comment. We have a lot of wonderful things happening on this podcast and also on our History Twist podcast coming up. So come back soon, folks. I really think you'll enjoy it.
Indeed. So I guess that's goodbye for now. And I echo what Dr. Deneen said. Do give us a like. We appreciate it. But more importantly, come on back soon.